In 1935, the Belgian economic historian Henry Pirenne, in his final book, proposed the famous Pirenne thesis. He argued, without Muhammad there would have been no Charlemagne. Today, I would like to use the same sentence structure to declare to you. Without Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of unified China, there would have been no Xiongnu Empire of the northern steppes. Perhaps most people will find the statement that Qin Shi Huang was the founding father of the Xiongnu is counterintuitive. As we all know, Qin Shi Huang, who founded the Qin dynasty, which turned into what the world calls China today, was one of the Xiongnu's most formidable enemies. He sent General Meng Tian to lead the Qin dynasty's army in his campaign to the north. The result was just as described in the historical text, the Faults of Qin. The Xiongnu were driven back over 220 miles. The Hu people dared not come south to graze their horses. Moreover, the Xiongnu already existed during China's Warring States period before Qin Shi Huang, which makes the timeline inconsistent. So where did the statement that Qin Shi Huang was the founding father of the Xiongnu even come from? Actually, this statement, like without Muhammad there would have been no Charlemagne, is an argument based on socio-economic history. The logic of the Pirenne thesis is that the Arab expansion disrupted the Mediterranean trade during the classical era, shifting the economic center of gravity in Europe toward the northwest, which led to the rise of the Carolingian Empire. Similarly, the logic of my thesis is that it was the unification of the Qin-Han Empire that forced the northern nomadic peoples to form a large-scale nomadic empire, enabling the nomads to obtain essential resources for survival from the central plains in the south. According to the records of the Grand Historian, the first Chanyu of the Xiongnu was Qin-Han Chanyu, who lived during the same era as Qin Shi Huang. Before Qin-Han Chanyu, the Xiongnu might have had earlier leaders, but their power could not compare with the power of the later Chanyas. In other words, the birth of the first steppe empire in northern China occurred around the same time as the establishment of the first unified empire in the Chinese Central Plains. This is clearly no coincidence. To be honest, this is not just my thesis, as the connection between nomadic polities and sedentary peoples has long been a well-established theory in the field of history. Historians like Anatoly Kazanov and Sevyon Weinstein from Russia, Owen Lattimore, Thomas Barfield, and Nicola D. Cosmo from the US, and Wang Mingke and Luo Xin from China, these foremost experts on nomadic history from the past century had already proposed and refined the stuff I'm going to talk about today. This video is really just sharing some of the scholars' insights with a broader audience. In popular imagination, nomadic peoples throughout history have always been seen as eternal enemies and even subjected to dehumanizing portrayals, depicted wearing fierce masks and bearing two terrifying fangs much like in the movie Mulan. But history tells us that the relationship between nomadic and sedentary peoples has always been deeply intertwined, with each shaping and influencing the other. As our title suggests, Qin Shi Huang could also be considered the founding father of the Xiongnu. Before diving into the love-hate relationship between the Qin-Han Empire and the Xiongnu Empire, we must first dispel some old myths. Many historians of the 19th century believed, and many people still believe today, that nomadism was a primitive and barbaric form of society, and that nomadic societies appeared before agricultural civilizations and eventually evolved into them. However, archaeological and historical findings in the 20th century have overturned this view. In fact, not only did nomadic societies emerge later than agricultural societies, but specialized nomadism was a highly sophisticated way of life and production that required a high level of knowledge and technical skills. Through nomadism, humans were able to survive on lands with extremely scarce resources, making the most efficient use of limited vegetation and water sources. Experts on nomadic history, such as Thomas Barfield, believe that the initial formation of the nomadic economy in Eurasia was related to the increasingly cold and dry climate change from 2000 to 1000 BC. To combat the climate change, people made use of the already increasingly scarce resources and began expanding the scale of animal husbandry and the range of their grazing. It is worth noting that the emergence of a nomadic economy did not necessarily mean the formation of a nomadic society. During this period, people still relied primarily on agriculture and engaged in a variety of livelihoods. It was not until after 1000 BC, when horses began to be used as riding animals, that human mobility significantly increased, making a form of society highly dependent on the nomadic economy truly possible. However, the process of nomadization was not completed overnight. In the 8th century BC, the Rong tribes to the west and the Di tribes to the north of ancient China were all not yet fully nomadic peoples, but rather semi-agricultural and semi-pastoral tribes, including the Baidi and Shanrong, who roamed the North China region, and the Chuan Rum, who destroyed Western Zhou dynasty in the Central Plains, the original center of Chinese civilization that was named to distinguish ancient China from the barbaric tribes that lived outside of it, and which later remained as what China calls itself today, the Central State. It was not until the Warring States period that nomadic peoples such as the Xiongnu, as well as the Linhu and Lofan, who would later join the Xiongnu Confederation, also emerged in the north. Coincidentally, early nomadic peoples in Western Eurasia, such as the Scythians, Cimmerians, and Sarmatians, also emerged, and were active from the 8th to the 3rd centuries BC, fully demonstrating the consistency in the spread of technology and culture across the Eurasian steppe. Historians emphasize that the formation of nomadic societies did not mean that people abandoned other forms of the economy. Extensive cultivation, forest harvesting, and metal smelting were all important supplements to the nomadic economy, and no nomadic society could exist without them. The problem, however, was that these sideline activities on the steppes could not meet the social needs. Nomadic people still had to obtain the essential resources from sedentary societies, and there were only two ways to acquire them: either through trade or through robbery. Trade is a legitimate business that requires credibility and bargaining power to back it. Robbery may seem like a cost-free endeavor, but also requires the support of strong military force. A crucial prerequisite for credibility and military power is organization. Nomadic societies were inherently decentralized and autonomous, so forming an empire was in principle a very difficult thing to do. However, if the sedentary societies they were facing were too unified, establishing a stronger political entity became an inevitable choice for the nomads. So after Qin Shi Huang achieved the unification of the Central Plains in the 3rd century BC, the Xiongnu, who once fought separately under different leaders unknown by name, also emerged onto the historical stage as East Asia's first nomadic empire. Qin Shi Huang led the unification of the Central Plains, but the one who truly established and consolidated this achievement was Liu Yuan Emperor Gaozu of Han, the founding emperor of the Han dynasty, who was 3 years younger than him. Following the peasant rebellion led by Chen Sheng and Wu Guang and the collapse of the Qin dynasty, the power struggle between Liu Bang and Xiongnu, the hegemon king, was not merely a personal feud between the two ambitious warlords vying for supremacy. The Chu-Han contention. For China at the time, it was also a conflict between the two historical paths. In the end, the path of a unified dynastic empire represented by Liu Bang defeated the path of a multi-state system represented by Xiongnu. From this perspective, Liu Bang Emperor Gaozu of Han was the true successor to Qin Shi Huang's legacy. As the Central Plains region was making a defining choice in their history, the steppes to the north was also undergoing major changes in response. The Xiongnu leader, the famous Grand Chanyu, had just defeated the Yuzhou Fan and Donghu tribes and founded the Xiongnu Empire. Among them, the Yuzi were the longtime rivals and strongest enemies of the Xiongnu. For the Xiongnu, defeating the Yuzi was just as significant as when Emperor Gaozu of Han defeated the hegemon king. So just as Emperor Gaozu had barely secured his throne in the imperial capital Chang'an, he was horrified to find an unprecedentedly powerful nomadic empire looming in the north, one that would remain the Han dynasty's greatest enemy for the next several centuries. The birth of the twin stars, the Qin-Han Empire and the Xiongnu Empire, was no mere coincidence. The Xiongnu Empire emerged as the adaptation to the Qin-Han Empire. The unification of the steppes was the inevitable response to the unification of the Central Plains. While the Han dynasty was succeeding the Qin dynasty and consolidating its imperial system, the people on the steppes were also busy consolidating an unprecedented new polity, and with remarkable success. During the time of Qin Shi Huang, Grand Chanyu was defeated by the Qin army and fled in disarray, but just a few decades later, his son Grand Chanyu was able to force Emperor Gaozu of Han to sign the treaty under coercion after the Battle of Baideng. The Battle of Baideng marked the beginning of the 400 years of war and peace between the Han and the Xiongnu. In this contest between the Central Plains Empire and the Steppe Empire, while the Xiongnu had their moments of glory, the Han dynasty generally held the upper hand. The inherent weakness of the Xiongnu Empire lay in the fact that it was, at its core, a response to the establishment of the Qin-Han Empire. The very purpose of a Xiongnu state was to extract the resources from the powerful Central Plains Empire. Once this goal could not be achieved smoothly, or when those resources could be obtained by other means, the Xiongnu state would then face the risk of being divided or even collapse. In order to thwart the Xiongnu state's attempts to obtain the resources, the Han dynasty maintained the vast Great Wall. The core function of the Great Wall was to block trade and plunder. Historian Nicola di Cosmo even considered the Great Wall as offensive rather than defensive. Moreover, the Han Empire sent envoys to the western regions and dispatched troops to the northeast, cutting the Xiongnu's ties with the oasis agriculture of the Tarim Basin and with various ethnic groups in Northeast Asia, forcing the Xiongnu to rely on the Han dynasty as their sole source of supplies. Based on this, the Han dynasty adopted a carrot-and-stick policy to divide and dismantle the Xiongnu. On the one hand, it used the core trade to win over the Xiongnu. On the other hand, it periodically sent troops to undermine the Xiongnu's economic base. The Han army's yearly spring raids were even more devastating to the Xiongnu than those few major victories won by famous Han generals like Wei Qing and his nephew Wu Chu-bing, the Marquis of Champion, during the Han-Xiongnu Wars under Emperor Wu of Han. Year after year, the Han dynasty disrupted the Xiongnu's livelihood, drawing them to choose trade over war. The Han dynasty's efforts to dismantle the foundations of the nomadic state's existence were not in vain. During the transition between the two Han dynasties, the Xiongnu also repeatedly fell into internal turmoil, eventually just splitting into the two factions. The Southern Xiongnu submitted to the Eastern Han dynasty, while the Northern Xiongnu gradually gradually declined, marking the end of the Xiongnu's empire period. The Southern Xiongnu obtained the resources through trade with the Han dynasty, the Eastern Han dynasty and later its successors, the Chao Wei dynasty of the Three Kingdoms, and the Western Jin dynasty were also adept at absorbing, dividing, and suppressing the Southern Xiongnu. However, no matter how much the Central Plains dynasties undermined the foundations of the nomadic state, the Xiongnu never collapsed or disappeared, because whether in war or peace, the nomads needed to maintain a state structure in order to interact with another unified empire. The only possibility of abandoning the Xiongnu state was if the Central Plains Empire ceased to exist first. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, as the Eastern Han dynasty declined and the Central Plains fell apart, the Xiongnu Empire finally lost its reason to exist and entered the grave alongside the Qin-Han Empire. In 304, as the Western Jin Empire was collapsing from within, Liu Yuan, the Grand Chanyu of the Southern Xiongnu, took advantage and declared his independence, proclaiming the restoration of the Han regime and ushering in the chaotic era of the 16 kingdoms of the 5 Hu. His Xiongnu-led Hanzhao regime soon perished amid the chaos, and the term Xiongnu also disappeared from history and officially became a historical term. Looking back, there's a real historical irony in the fact that Liu Yuan, a Xiongnu, chose Han as the name of his regime. The Xiongnu Empire arose because of the Qin-Han Empire, and with the fall of the Han, the Xiongnu too met their end. Yet in their final moment before disappearing from history, they were, remarkably, the same regime. The Han dynasty was the longest-lasting unified imperial dynasty in Chinese history, and the Xiongnu Empire was also the longest-lasting steppe empire in Chinese history. Both empires were established and collapsed at almost the same time. Historians have analyzed this unusual coincidence and extended the pattern to later periods. After the Xiongnu, the Rouran Khaganate, the Turkic Khaganate, and the Uyghur Khaganate dominated the steppes. When the dynasties in the Central Plains were powerful, the steppe empires would also rise in power. In contrast, when the Central Plains declined, the dominant powers on the steppes would also become relatively weak. In the 9th century, after the decline of the Tang dynasty, China entered its second long chaotic period of being divided since the 16 Kingdoms period. Meanwhile, the north also experienced a power vacuum that lasted for 3 centuries, during which not one empire was able to dominate the entire steppes. Until the 13th century, when the Mongol Empire emerged before the unification of the Central Plains. This was an exception, but it is undeniable that the Jurchen-led Jin dynasty and the Khitan-led Western Liao dynasty, which ruled northern China at the time, were already the 2 most powerful regimes in Asia before being conquered by the Mongol Empire. After the Yuan, Ming, and Qing dynasties rebuilt the unified Chinese empire, they adopted a different approach to dealing with the nomads than before. The Yuan dynasty and Qing dynasty channeled vast quantities of resources to the Mongolian steppes, while the Ming dynasty underwent a transformation from confrontation to mutual trade. Massive nomadic empires like the Xiongnu or the Gokturks never emerged again. However, the nomads still occasionally formed formidable tribal alliances, such as the Oirets and the Tatars during the Ming dynasty and the Zhongars during the Qing dynasty. The nomadic economy was, by nature, a dependent economy. It relied on material exchange with sedentary economies. This dependency determined that nomadic political structures evolved in response to sedentary political structures, with the latter exerting a profound influence on the former. Aside from the Chinese Central Plains, there were 2 other sedentary regions, or the breakthrough points, that the nomads of the Eurasian steppe frequently interacted with: Eastern Europe and the India-Greater Iran region. In both regions, the nomads also responded to changes within the sedentary civilizations. Thus, the Persians collided with the Scythians and the Romans encountered the Huns. The divided India became a haven for small groups of adventurers. The Grand Duchy of Moscow and its successors witnessed the final glory of the Crimean Khanate. The nomads of the Eurasian steppe were like a cyclone constantly shifting in response to the surrounding pressure. When they met with strong pressure in one area, their momentum would divert toward weaker points. Yet around the point of pressure, they could also gather into a strong force. Neither Qin Shi Huang nor Emperor Gaozu of Han realized that they were also the founding fathers of the Xiongnu Empire, just as Cyrus the Great of the Persian Empire, until the very moment he died at the hands of the Scythians. Never understood why or how these nomads became such a formidable threat, yet history loves to play out in this dialectical way. Just as the invasions of the Rong and Di tribes during the Zhou dynasty led to the concept of the Chinese people of the Central Plains in ancient China, the establishment of the unified dynastic empires also shaped the nomadic empires of history. If Qin Shi Huang were alive today, he must have mixed feelings about how the northern frontier he built not only failed to protect his great Qin Empire, but also provoked the rebellion of Chen Sheng and Wu Guang, who shouted, "Neither king nor noble is born to rule," a slogan that resonated with the Chinese people across generations, and also gave rise to a nomadic people called Xiongnu, who lasted for more than 500 years. Our eyes are always on the frontiers, especially those of the so-called central state, China. Thank you for watching.